From classic whodunits to modern psychological thrillers, each episode offers exclusive insights, behind-the-scenes stories, and discussions on the art of crafting compelling crime narratives. Whether you're a seasoned investigator or a newcomer to the genre, Books to Die For is your ultimate guide to the thrilling world of crime literature.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. Got Mr. Dave Martino.
That's right.
We've got a writer here that's got a book out called The Last Stories, The Murder of an Investigative Journalist in Las Vegas. So, author Kane, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Author. So, let's talk about this story. So, first of all, how did you come across this? How did it happen where you ran into this story?
Well, it was one of these things where I was involved personally, which is kind of strange for a journalist. But I worked with Jeff, the guy who was murdered, for 6 years on the investigative team here at the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Obviously, we were notified by police that he was murdered in the front yard of his house, and we were all shocked. And over Labor Day weekend 2022, and we didn't know what was happening. We didn't really think it had anything to do with his job. And then within a couple of days, they arrested one of the people he was writing about, a county official named Robert Tellis, who he had written some stories about some problems in his office and an affair that he was allegedly having with a co-worker. Police and prosecutors said that the reason he was killed was to stop his investigation and stop him doing stories and possibly retribution for what he wrote, which ended up being a pretty big national story because journalists in the United States usually don't face that kind of violence, or very rarely do, and especially not from a public official, if that's what the police and prosecutors are writing.
So you knew Jeff German for quite a while?
Yeah, I started at the RJ and the investigative team in 2016, at the end of 2016, and he was already here, and so we worked from 2016 December to his death in 2022 September.
So what can you tell us about him? What kind of reporting did he do? Did he do stories on lawbreakers, mafia, or what was his storyline in general?
He'd been here for 40 years, so he came right out of college in Milwaukee. He graduated from a master's degree in Marquette and moved to Vegas and worked for the Sun for quite a few years. Sun is a kind of competing paper, and so he started there and worked there till 2009 when he was laid off, and then came to the Review-Journal a few months after he was laid off, and he pretty much covered every big story we had in Vegas. He covered the big MDM fire that killed a bunch of people. He covered the mob a lot. There's a lot of interaction between him and the former mayor who used to be a mob attorney before he became mayor of Vegas. You can see his life follows a little bit of the movie Casino, right? A lot of those stories that are in the movie Casino are stories that Jeff covered in real life with people like the Joe Pesci character, who was based on a guy named Spilatro. And so he kind of chronicled Vegas up from pretty much his early career all the way up to his death, and it's kind of the reporter who had been here the longest.
You know, with these kind of cases, so he was reporting on people that were doing illegal things or alleged illegal things before. Like, this isn't the first time he did this kind of a case. So had he ever had threats before, or do you guys ever get threats regularly there?
You get some kind of nutty people call up and yell or anonymously do it. He has had, as the book details, he has had a lot more interaction and threats than I have in my career, and I've kind of done the same kind of work for over 30 years. He was punched at a party he was at a retirement party when he was covering courts for a court officer, and he ran into somebody he was writing about. The guy was basically collected debts for a loan shark, and at the same time he was a county official who's a bailiff in the courts, and at the same time he also collected campaign money for the sheriff. And so Jeff found that to be an interesting story, and at the time he was writing a column for the Sun, so he was kind of taking the county to task for having a guy with those kind of backgrounds as an employee. And he ran into the guy, and the guy punched him, and he got a few stitches, and he got a bunch of columns afterwards. So he didn't really get cowed by it. And then he's had a lot of conflict with politicians, obviously, which was nonviolent, but people going on TV and raking him over the coals for articles he wrote, and some disputes with other journalists. And again, not physical, but he had a long-running dispute with a guy named John Ralston, who was kind of his competitor. I write about that extensively in the story, that they kind of hated each other. And as a journalist, there's sometimes people, especially in competing papers, that rub you the wrong way. But for Jeff, this was something that they would write about in their columns. Ralston talked about it in a feature that the alternative paper was writing about him, and Jeff would take him to task in columns and in TV interviews that they did together and things like that. So Vegas is a bit of a rough and tumble town, and the book has a lot about Vegas and kind of the background of his life there, and how it's kind of a different place than most places.
Well, how did the police settle on Robert Tellis as the murder suspect?
Well, there was video from a camera across the street from Jeff's house. His neighbor had a pretty extensive camera system. The suspect was driving this old maroon Denali, and when the police flashed the photo or released a photo of the Denali, some people in Rob Tellis's office, or Tellis's office, he pronounces it both ways, in Rob Tellis's office, saw the picture, said, hey, he has a vehicle that's very similar to that his wife owns. And so at that point, the police a former law enforcement officer actually, who worked in the office, called or texted someone he knew at Metro and said, hey, you might want to look at this link. And so at that point, they were able to get a warrant based on that. They were able to search his house, and according to police, they found a lot of the clothing the suspect was wearing. His face wasn't visible from the body cam because he was dressed like a construction worker in the heat with a big hat and covering up. But they found the hat, and they found shoes and very other similar clothing. And then they also were able to find his DNA under Jeff's fingernails. And so there's not very good explanation of how that could get there if he wasn't involved. He claims that he was framed by a company that he was clashing with in his job as public administrator. And so that's going to be the court case that may start in August to find out if he's guilty of the murder.
So what does everybody in the town think? Like, what's the kind of atmosphere around this case?
Well, I think it was obviously shocking to anybody who knew him, and a lot of people knew him because he'd been here forever. I think it's, people are kind of stunned that a journalist would be killed for doing his job if the police and prosecutors are right about the motive. And, obviously it's been a high profile case. The national media flooded in after the news broke and covered it. We did 48 hours about it, and there was a segment on CBS Morning News and things like that. So it's been another big, I've been here for 7 or 8 years. I've covered some of the biggest stories of my career here just because I think Vegas is a pretty Wild West town. Jeff and I covered the October 1 Mandalay Bay shooting, which is, I think, still the most deadly mass shooting in U.S. history. And there's just been stories after stories, and the corruption that he and I uncovered either together or separately has been pretty extensive too. So it's definitely an amazing news town. Although, then you get a story like this that kind of hits home because you know the guy.
Writing this book, did you do a lot of research in this area? Has there been a lot of journalists or reporters shot and killed in the U.S. or attacked in some way in the last, let's say, 10 years?
There have been reporters, I think I write in the book about the Center to Protect Journalists has an ongoing list that they've had for about 30 years of reporters murdered or died in covering conflicts and stuff like that. And I was able to get their data and sort for U.S. reporters who were murdered. And there's in the last 30 years, there's about 17 who were murdered. Now, a lot of these are going to be, 5 of them are going to be the people who died in the mass shooting in Annapolis at the Gazette, at the Capitol newspaper there, when a disgruntled reader came in and shot the place up. And then a lot of the other ones are going to be, 2 reporters were killed because of a disgruntled coworker who had been fired and came after them while they were doing a live shoot. 2 of them were killed by mobsters or gang members or criminal type people. As far as I could tell, Jeff was the first reporter killed by a government official, by a public official, since the 1940s, when there was a radio reporter who was killed by a sheriff for writing about some of the property he owned that had prostitution and some other things, and I detail that in the book. But it's pretty rare. Obviously, we hear about it happening in Russia and in Mexico and other places fairly often where the government takes retribution on reporters, but we had hoped that was something that we could avoid, but it seems like now it's happening here.
Right. So what can you give us for any sort of details or information about what actually happened to him? Do we know?
Oh yeah, we do know. There's video of it. I mean, I've watched it. Basically, he was off work that day. It was the Friday before Labor Day weekend of 2022. He was a big fantasy football fan, and on Labor Day, everybody would meet in this fantasy football league to pick players. So he took the day off and made a long weekend because he was going to plan the players he was going to pick. And so he goes out, gets a burrito, gets home, is dressed in a pair of in casual shorts and a t-shirt. It's still hot. It's Vegas in September. Is still well over 100 degrees. I think it was 110 degrees that day. Something alerted him to a sound in his backyard. So he opens the garage door, walks out to the front of the house, and then opens the back gate to his back door. And then someone jumps out with a knife, stabs him 7 times in the neck, torso, and there's some defensive wounds on his hands. His carotid artery was basically severed, and so he collapsed behind a bush, and his neighbor didn't find him until the next day because when it's that hot, no one's really spending a lot of time walking around outside. And so he was found about 20. The coroner says he probably died, or experts that we talked to said, by seeing the autopsy, they said he probably died instantly. At some point, according to police, he was able to scrape the attacker, and then you see in the video the attacker kind of walks away quickly, goes to this SUV that was parked down the block, and then returns with the SUV, parks in front of Jeff's driveway, goes over to look, I guess, to maybe make sure that Jeff was dead and he didn't leave any witnesses, and then drives away. And so that's what the video shows, and that's what the police narrative says. And then really it's just for a jury to decide who the assailant was, because like I said, his face was covered. His truck didn't have any license plates on it. So Rob Tellis, I talked to him in jail. He claims that he was home that whole day by himself. His cell phone was at home. And so that's going to be the battle in court. He's claiming innocence and he doesn't want to take a plea. So, which is a bit unusual, but that's the status of it, is that right now they're going to, we are right now looking through, this is kind of a side note if you're interested, there was a year-long plus legal battle between the paper and the police and prosecutors to protect Jeff's sources because they seized his phone and laptops. And so right now a bunch of us are looking through those phone and laptops after we won the Supreme Court decision, and we're going to tell the police which is privileged information about his sources and what they can use for the investigation. So that delayed the trial a little bit because we're still fighting in court. And now we hope to get that done fairly quickly, and trial can proceed hopefully in August.
Well, what evidence do they have against him? Do they have any physical evidence?
Well, they've got the DNA under Jeff's fingernails from Rob Tellis, it's very hard to explain why his DNA would be there, because he had met him one time in person 6 months earlier when he was doing the original story. But you would think by that time, any DNA from a handshake would have gone missing. They have obviously the vehicle, which is similar, no plates. They have the video of the person who could be Rob, it's same kind of body and gait and stuff like that. And then they have what they said they found in his house, which was the cut up clothing that you can see on the video. They didn't find the knife. We're not sure why he kept the clothing, but he'd been cutting it up. So I don't know if he was planning to get rid of it or what, but they said that they had found the hat and the shoes and the bag that's seen on the video of the assailant in his house. And it's all in the grand jury case file. And, there's pictures of what it looked like when they found it and where they found it under his couch in his garage. A lot of people feel that, especially people who are close to Jeff, feel that's pretty overwhelming evidence. His story to me and other reporters was that as public administrator, where basically he handles probate cases, he was trying to shut down a company that he felt was abusing the system by taking over people's probate cases and then selling the property and stuff like that. And he says that this company somehow framed him. He can't explain the DNA. And he says they somehow must have gotten his DNA and planted it. They're going to argue that there was police misconduct in the case. And that's, and he's completely saying he had absolutely nothing to do with it and would never do anything like that. And he's been framed. So that's what's going to be kind of the drama in court to see if the jury believes that.
Who is Robert Tellis, by the way? What can you give us a little bit of maybe his backstory and what led to this?
Yeah, you bet. So Robert Tellis is was born in El Paso to a fairly prominent political family. His great uncle was the first Hispanic mayor of El Paso, and he ended up being a ambassador to Costa Rica for Robert Kennedy, and also worked in the Nixon administration. Ended up getting indicted for some things about bringing an illegal alien to be a housekeeper, and his career kind of ended in shame. His dad was a city council person who also ended up getting indicted federally for a bribery scheme. That kind of ended his career, even though he didn't go to prison for it. I believe he pled guilty to it, or there was some sort of conviction there. It's in the book. I can't remember off the top of my head what happened with that. So Rob left El Paso, went to Denver, worked in kind of menial blue-collar jobs, air conditioning, things like that. Moved to Vegas, got married, or he'd been married in someone in Colorado, got divorced and got remarried, has 3 children, and then he went to law school. And then as soon as he went to law school, he starts having these problems where he gets drunk and makes inappropriate advances towards a woman in law school that causes a big rift because he was president of the student association at the time, which they want to remove him. Then he in private practice, there's all these allegations of other inappropriate behavior, many times with women. We found out only after the fact, because nobody covers DUI court here because it's just kind of not usually very newsworthy. But we found out that even as county administrator or public administrator, he was arrested for assaulting his wife. There's video of him demanding to be let go because he's a public official. So he talked to reporters about that and said, he had a drinking problem, that he stopped after the alleged domestic assault. I think he ended up getting a deferred sentence on that. So he has had a history of acting out and maybe not being held responsible for it. And so he was private practice for a little while, and then when the public administrator here was retiring, he was in the Democratic Party, and they selected him to be public administrator in 2019. And then, of course, after Jeff wrote the story, he lost the primary to his first deputy, who was one of the people quoted in Jeff's story about the problems in the office. And so his political career was definitely, if not over, was definitely damaged by what Jeff wrote. And, people had said that he always thought he was going to be governor or something like that. And so he started his political career that ended pretty quickly after his actions in office.
Well, he still might be, the way things are going. So what is it you hope people get out of the book? What is it that you wanted to write the book for?
I wanted to tell Jeff's story because I think his compelling story that's set in a compelling place, like Las Vegas. But I also wanted people, there's a lot of people who are down on journalists, right? And some of that is brought in onto us by ourselves, by, a lot of hardworking journalists, and they a lot of them get a bad rap because what some of the national media does, and Jeff was one of those people, and he was just there to get the truth and try to get the facts out about government corruption and graft and people wasting taxpayer money and things like that. And so I hope people read it and realize that journalists aren't the enemy. They're actually, a lot of us are trying to do the right thing.
When you go through a case like this, were there things that you learned that surprised you?
The amount of vitriol and conflict that he had in his career, I think definitely surprised me. Because like I said, I'd been doing investigative reporting for 15 years out of my 30 years as a journalist, and I've done some pretty hard-hitting stuff, and I never got to this level of attacks and physical and personal attacks that he had. And then I think just the history of Vegas, I didn't know it very well until I started researching this book, and it's pretty compelling. It's pretty it's a crazy place, and it's Wild West still, and it has been for years, and anything pretty much goes, and it still is. And like I said earlier, I think some of the most compelling stories that I've done in my career have been here. So it's definitely all in the book. It's not just about Jeff. It's about the city, and it's about the murder, and it's about the suspect in the case, and it's about Jeff's life, and it's about Jeff's life. It's about the Vegas seen through Jeff's life and how he was kind of there for every moment.
Well, what do you think, was there something about him, and I don't want to, it's not, trying to blame a victim, but was there something about him was he confrontational? Why did he get so much vitriol, do you think? Why is there so much of that going on as compared to yourself?
I think I've always thought I was more confrontational than he was, and maybe he was in his younger days. There were a lot of people who said in his younger days he was really arrogant and off-putting. Even his friends told me that. But I think it's more of Vegas's kind of, like I said, Wild West kind of attitude, and for decades, the power structure here were criminals. They weren't in the mob. There were people who were running casinos who had been accused of murdering people, of all kinds of crime. And so it's kind of, it's been cleaned up for a few years, at least we think. But I think there's just kind of this attitude that anything goes and you can get away with this kind of stuff. So I don't know if he was more confrontational than a lot of other successful investigative reporters. He definitely didn't let a story go. I will tell you that after he got punched, I found 3 or 4 columns of him writing about the guy who punched him, right? So it wasn't like he was going to be cowed by somebody with physical violence. And I think, this is just kind of a bad thing that happened. And I think it in a way, it's kind of random. I don't really think it was anything he did. I just think it was a circumstance. And I talk about how it's almost like walking outside and getting hit by a meteor or a truck. It just was a bad set of circumstances that happened to him.
So how do you think this whole process has changed you? Like going through the story, going through this event from the side, and then writing a book about it?
Well, I think I am a little bit more cautious. I mean, I think a whole paper is more cautious in that if there is any kind of even, you might have laughed off a threat earlier and now you're definitely reporting it to authorities. I think it obviously changes you to know that this kind of thing can happen, even if it is just a bad random situation. I don't think my reporting, well, I'm an editor now, so that may take me a little bit one step away from the crossfire because I'm running the investigative team now instead of just being a reporter on it. And my name isn't in the paper anymore. But I think for the 6 to 8 months before I became editor, I wrote just as hard-hitting stories about his death and other things that I knew about that I would have before that. So I think I intentionally didn't want it to change what we do, because then if police are right and prosecutors are right, then what happened there, then he succeeded in changing the accountability and investigative reporting at the top paper in the state. And so we weren't going to let him do that if that's what happened.
Wow. Okay. So now the book is available everywhere now. Do you put out any contact information, or what should you have, like social media, website, things like that for readers or people?
Yeah, you can follow me at Arthur M. Kane, Arthur middle initial M, and Kane on Twitter. The book is out on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all the other places you can buy the book. Just look for The Last Story by Arthur Kane. I hope people read it and understand what journalists really do, because it's not what sometimes is perceived by the mass public. We do spend a lot of time digging. We do spend a lot of time going through public records that the average person doesn't know how to do, and we try to give you the best version of the truth that we possibly can. And I hope the book is the best version of the truth of Jeff's life and what happened to him.
Well, we appreciate you coming on, talking about your story, talking about the book. Of course, it's called The Last Story. It's the murder of an investigative journalist in Las Vegas, and Arthur Kane is the author of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.